Welcome to today's webinar. This is Jeff Roach, partner at SiVal Advisors in Silicon Valley. I'll be your host today. This is the first of a series of webinars and other information we call Silicon Valley M&A Insights. So anyway, without further delay, I would like to introduce our two panelists, Craig Lilly and Jan Robertson, and I'll turn it over to Jan. Jan?
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to be hosting this webinar for you. My background, you can see on the slide there, deep M&A background, big banking experience in the past, and co-founder of SiVal Advisors back in 2002, and we've been going strong and growing our firm ever since, doing mid-market M&A, including a lot of cross-border transactions. So delighted to be here today, and I'll turn it over to Craig.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Craig Lilly. I'm an M&A corporate partner with Baker McKenzie. I have extensive experience advising technology clients and private equity clients on mergers and acquisitions. I co-chair our West Coast M&A practice. Baker McKenzie is an international law firm located in 47 countries with 8 offices here in the United States. We also, kind of our claim to fame, we're the #1 law firm in cross-border M&A by volume. So thank you very much.
And SiVal Advisors, there's a picture of our team. Our senior team partners are in the top row, and other advisors. You can see a mix of industries there, mostly technology related, hardware, software, medical device, 16 years in business, and a lot of international M&A as well. Tell a few war stories throughout the presentation. So. First of all, selling a business, maximizing the value. Here's what we're going to talk about today. We've been through the introductions. We'll talk a little bit about the current market and how global M&A is very important and factoring into what we do here in Silicon Valley, why planning is important, what makes a business saleable, how do we find the buyers and what are some of the characteristics and categories, how do we value a business, and the sale process, timing, and very importantly, legal, minimizing your risk while maximizing the sale value. So the current market. The high water mark for M&A really was 2015. Global M&A was the highest back then. We're still setting a very good pace. The stock market is still robust, as everyone knows, and M&A follows mostly correlated to stock market activity and valuations. Many foreign buyers here. What we've noticed over the past year or two is that the mix has changed. We're seeing a lot more from Europe and also Japan and Korea. China is down statistically 81% fewer deals from China in 2017 versus 2016 related to currency controls and also more CFIUS, the Foreign Investment Review Agency here in the U.S. As I mentioned, the stock market, who knows how long the stock market has to run and therefore how long the good M&A market will last, but none of us has a crystal ball. We're all hoping that 2018 continues strong as it has. Interest rates clearly affect the stock market and valuations, 3 increases in 2017, and more are anticipated in 2018. So we'll see how that all plays out. Cash on corporate balance sheets continues very strong. And what the effects are of the tax cuts and repatriation, none of us really knows. History has taught us, though, when we look back, that most of the cash that comes back from repatriation ends up dividends or stock buybacks. A couple other brief trends. We're seeing a lot of top tech acquirers buying non-core investments, and there have been some big areas. Autonomous vehicles and software related to those is a huge area of big investments. PE, buying more growth and technology stocks, or businesses rather. And especially we've noticed an interesting trend with private equity that SaaS, software as a service, there are specialized PE funds now that are rolling up smaller mid-market software as a service firms. So I think that's good news for many companies here in Silicon Valley. We mentioned M&A is global. Surprisingly, the global M&A market is very important to the mid-market. Silicon Valley is a very attractive area for technology companies, clearly, and attractive to many international buyers. And often we find in our practice that the best strategic fit is for finding maximum value for our client companies is in fact overseas. And so we make sure that in every deal we work on here, every company we represent, we look at the international markets and see if some of the right buyer or buyers might be internationally. Exits don't just happen. In order to maximize value, it requires planning, realistic expectations as to valuation, and this is a very important issue that it's important to level set early on in the engagement. Disciplined execution, we'll talk about how we do that and work hand in glove with other professionals such as attorneys, the right attorney for M&A such as Craig, and also the process and some of the pitfalls and the timing. We've talked a bit about the market. It's a good market right now, but also in the company life cycle. Planning. Why should one plan? It gives you, as a business owner, better control over when and how the exit occurs. You want to be ready, the optimal time in your company life cycle and in the industry. A lot of times industries are consolidating. Perhaps you're approached by potential buyers. And you want to be able to get ready and be able to act when the time is right. And of course, contingencies. Many things we can't control, so we need to be ready. And of course, it gives you the ability to maximize value. Never too early to start. Most venture capitalists and private equity, when they invest in a company, they consider what their potential exits might be upon investment. So it's important to consider who the future buyers of your business might be as you're growing your business and what the exit potential might be. Realistically, it takes a minimum of 6 months. We say sometimes 12, but I would say 6, 8, 10, perhaps on average, to sell a business from start to finish. And that is preparing the documents and taking it to market and doing a thorough canvas. There are 3 key areas we're going to discuss: the business management preparation, the financial and taxes, and legal. From a business management point of view, CEO, COO, and below, very important to build the management team and make sure that the business isn't all about the owner or small group of owners who are probably selling the business because they want to exit and possibly retire or go on to do other things. So it's important to have built the management team, focus on revenue growth and credible forecasts. Often we see private companies that have not been accustomed to building a forecast. They may have a budget, but it's important to really give some thought to where your business is going in the next year to 2 to 3 years, because buyers will certainly ask when they're evaluating the business. Secure IP, patents, and trademarks. And I think I'll pause here and let Craig make some comments about securing the IP and particularly your patents.
Yes, I mean, one of the common mistakes we see with the companies is often they won't have their employees sign proprietary invention assignment agreements. And basically, if you fail to do that, the employees can make a claim that they own the IP. So, it's amazing how often this happens, particularly with companies that have developed software, which you may not be filing patents if you haven't had proper documentation showing that the employees have assigned all the IP that they develop. So that's a common issue. We've seen deals, die over this. We represented a foreign buyer who was trying to buy a technology company here in Silicon Valley, and basically just because it wasn't documented properly with both employees and consultants, it wasn't definitely determined that they actually own the IP that they thought they had developed. Obviously, you want to look at litigation, license agreements, make sure trademarks are done properly as well. Often you could have companies that have deceptively similar names as well that we've seen in the past. And this kind of goes back to, why you prepare for sale and diligence, because it can reduce or eliminate risk and surprises, improves the speed to close, and also provides more deal and price certainty. So if you don't analyze these things in advance, you obviously can run into issues and potentially reduce the price or even stop the deal from proceeding. So it basically, these type of issues allows the seller to understand and proactively address any potential concerns that the buyer have, and obviously reduces burdens any redundant type of inquiries, and ultimately allows for the transaction to be efficiently sold at the maximum price, and allows management obviously to spend more time focused on their operational goals.
Terrific. And then trimming costs where possible. EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And that's quite a mouthful, but that is one of the keys to valuing private companies. When buyers do their ROI calculations, when they're looking at a private company's financials to assess what the valuation they're willing to pay and interested in paying, cash flow, which EBITDA is a measure of, and revenue projections are critical, so they can see when they're going to get their payback forecasted out and what their return on investment might be. So EBITDA, a very important number. Diversify the revenue base, especially if you're dependent on a few key customers. Now, I will mention a caveat on this one. We have definitely sold businesses over the years that are highly dependent on one or two key customers. Quick story, a couple of years ago we sold a business, and they had one very excellent, this was in the medical device field, excellent large medical device. They were a software and hardware supply company. And what we found when we did an international canvas is that we found the right buyer, actually a couple of them, overseas, who coveted the customer relationship and in fact moved forward and paid a very handsome multiple for the business based on the fact that they really needed to penetrate this key customer here in the U.S. And our client was the door that would unlock that relationship. So I say that with tempering it, but ideally the best kind of business to sell is the kind that has a diversified revenue base. And word on redundant assets, for instance, if you have anything that is on your balance sheet that's not central to running the business, such as anything excess, then that should be segregated and taken off the balance sheet that you show to buyers. Financial statements, one of the most important things and one of the big gotchas in the M&A process is not having your financials reviewed or even audited. Ideally audited, but reviewed for 3 years is usually will suffice. And buyers will discount value based on their things they find in due diligence and if the financial statements have not been audited. We had a situation not too long ago, last year or so, where the foreign buyer looked at the company and our client had basically decided not to get, despite our advice, the financial statements reviewed, and we were scrambling to find the right CPA firm to do an audit, and it held up the deal for a good month. So very important. We've talked about EBITDA, and another point on EBITDA is if there are any non-recurring or owner expenses related, and these are some of the things we can help you in preparing the financial statements for presenting to buyers, but these are key issues. Tax and estate planning, I don't think we need to get into it, but suffice to say there are a lot of planning things you can do, especially if you have family in the business, set up certain trusts, grants and grats, and there are experts who deal in this type of these type of legal matters. And valuations, again, setting the expectations very early on. Sometimes what we do even before getting engaged, if we have some concerns about a company's value and hence the saleability, then we will ask to see financial statements ahead of time and take a look. And then there are various metrics that we use as professionals to value the business before we take it to market, and some of those involve looking at comparable market multiples of private and public company transactions. Legal, Craig, I'll turn this one over to you for commentary.
Well, thank you, Jan. So obviously when you prepare to sell your company, you want to have your books organized and your records and other legal documents in preparation for the due diligence. Recently we occurred on the buy side, the seller had very incomplete records and minute books, and it delayed the closing and also impacted the escrows and indemnifications that the buyer was seeking, since they were very concerned about their incomplete records. So the company must be prepared, for the diligence process by setting up an online data room, or sometimes called a virtual data room, to house all the company information. A buyer obviously will insist on seeing all material contracts, minutes, and resolutions. Secondly, obviously you want to understand the various stakeholder rights, both in debt and equity. On the equity side, obviously there can be, provisions, whether they're drag rights or shareholder agreements, that can impact the sale of the business, whether they're required consents or otherwise. Assuming also on the debt side, there obviously could be change of control provisions that are be triggered for a potential sale transaction. Third, the ownership and cap table is obviously a utmost concern. We've had situations where the cap table and the documents were inconsistent. For example, we've seen just a war story is that in the past we've seen a few times where the company, either some shareholder or person who was an employee who was not a shareholder, came up with a document, whether it was an email or some type of letter that said that they were promised X% of the company. And obviously, the cap table is a reflection of the shareholders, and you don't necessarily refer to things as percentages. So it was very difficult to determine what exactly the person owned and at what time. So those are obviously very big concerns. Fourth, you want to clarify any contractual rights might affect value. Obviously, all the material contracts need to be reviewed, not only for material provisions, but also for assignment and change of control provisions, particularly if you have an asset sale. So to the extent that any key contracts or leases may require consents for a change of control, those consents should be identified early, and a plan should be developed to obtain those consents. The intellectual property and ownership rights are obviously of utmost concern, especially with technology companies. As we mentioned, you need to have a very clear documentation that the company owns all the proprietary invention and assignment rights that the employee develops during their employee status, as well as with consultants. Obviously, sometimes we run in situations where there's not proper documentations with consultants who have worked on the development of patents, and that can be concerns as well. The last two items, obviously, we want to have very complete employee files. Some common issues are in the past that we have come across, obviously some wage and hour claims, depending on classification of employees, that can obviously be of utmost concern. About a year ago, we worked on a deal where we acquired a foreign company. Actually, it was a U.S. company, but they had a foreign subsidiary. and the seller had misclassified their employees and the amount of hours they worked. They had added, they had deducted, or they had actually added the number of lunchtime periods to their 40-hour work week. Instead, they were supposed to deduct it from their 40-hour work week. So in essence, all that time was overtime. And they had classified these employees like that for numerous years. And so the amount of unpaid wages went into the millions of dollars. And so that obviously was a heightened risk for the buyer and something they obviously had to provide for some indemnification and escrow amounts for as well. Obviously, the last time, the regulatory issues with the convergence of technology that we're seeing right now, where you see a lot of tech companies and obviously buying non-tech companies. And then obviously the opposite, where you have a lot of industrial companies such as automotive and food companies. Now they're buying technology companies and running into regulatory issues where in the past maybe they haven't. And obviously in a lot of disruptive type areas as well in fintech, there's a lot of regulatory issues and concerns as well. So those type of issues need to be addressed up front, as well as if you have a foreign buyer, such as a Chinese or Asian buyer. We talked about the CFIUS type issues, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. That type of process can take very long. It can take up to 90 to 120 days to get approval. And the U.S. is now, under the current administration, looking into those issues more and more in detail. And there's obviously, some people may be aware of it, Senator Cornyn from Texas recently proposed a bill to make artificial intelligence a mandatory filing under CFIUS. So if that passes, that obviously will have a major impact on artificial intelligence companies or companies that even remotely use artificial intelligence in their operations and business.
Thank you, Craig. And one other comes to mind as we're talking through this, taxes. And not just income taxes, but we have seen, certain types of specialized tax. We had a situation a while ago where we found out our client, there was some tax, an excise tax that had not been paid properly, and as a supplier they were contractually bound to their bigger customer to pay this excise tax. And so what ended up happening is the attorneys had to set up a specialized escrow related to this excise tax that to take care of a potential tail in the future. So many legal issues, and it's important to be working with the right law firm that's savvy and experienced in these issues. Okay, so planning. What are some of the reasons why, possible reasons for selling? Sometimes your industry is hot and there are companies out shopping. You may have been approached by one or more interested buyers. Ideally, your business is growing and profitable and therefore attractive to multiple buyers. And we'll talk about the value of growth and promise curve a little later. It's a cautionary story at the end here. And lastly, you may have intellectual property that is terrific, but you need the capital to penetrate the market and also the market reach. So you may need to sell your business to a larger entity which has the right channels for realizing the power of your IP. And of course, there are sometimes neutral and unfortunately negative drivers as well. Retirement or burnout, those are manageable. Those could be okay, provided that you've built a team or your business easily folds into a larger acquirer. Sometimes your investors, venture-backed portfolio end of life, and they simply want to sell the business, and that situation is manageable too. Need for liquidity, very important driver. The one negative one there is technology obsolescence. If your technology is obsolete and that's impacting your business and therefore the valuation, that can make it very difficult to sell the business. And that's one of the things that we look for when we evaluate whether or not to take on a client. Um, the old phrase, begin with the end in mind. If you want to climb that ladder to the pot of gold, build your business with the exit in mind. And you want to build a saleable business. So what makes a business saleable? We've talked about some of these things. IP is interesting because we had a situation, one of the things we always ask for our client in our list of due diligence items to get us going is, well, give us a list of your patents, your intellectual property, and tell us all about that. And we usually receive a list, but sometimes we find that the IP has nothing to do with the business, and we've had a couple of surprising situations where they had IP but have built a valuable business that really has nothing to do with the IP. So that's an interesting one. Market traction, this is the holy grail for business owners. If you have customers, revenues, subscribers, and ideally recurring, diversified, and profitable, these are the ideal things that make for a business to be saleable. Yes, if you don't have all these things, the business can be sold, but it's a lot more challenging and takes a lot more work and expertise to make it happen. Ideally, repeatable, transferable products or services or a business that can be folded into a much larger business and someone else can continue to manage it after the owners have transitioned. And ideally, as we talked about before, a team willing to stay if they're properly incentivized by the buyer. And there are some nuances and technicalities of how that's done properly. So who are the buyers these days? The number one and most important thing we find in selling a business is to identify the right strategic buyers who have a compelling need to own your business and will therefore bid aggressively. Fear and greed, just like in the stock market, fear and greed also motivates the M&A process. And one of the key things we do once engaged is to identify who the right strategic buyers are. What do we mean by strategic? Well, they could be competitors or to your business or other businesses that are in complementary sectors to your business for whom owning you would give them a leg up over their competition or enable them to grow more rapidly. As I mentioned earlier, we're in a global market, so we look to the rest of the world, not just the United States, which we find is increasingly important for mid-market companies to have the net cast globally. We'll get into a little bit later how we manage this process and how we identify them, but strategics are very important. A word about private equity. There are literally thousands of private equity firms in the United States here and also internationally. And rather than, and many of them are shopping. I mean, there isn't a day that goes by that myself and partners don't get contacted in some fashion by private equity funds looking for deals. And many of them are what I'll call more generic or broadly looking for companies of a certain size with a certain EBITDA. And when we're selling a company, we don't start with the private equity. We will typically start and identify the strategics. We may find that some of the strategics, medium-sized companies or smaller, are backed by private equity and therefore have a war chest to make acquisitions. But what's important is to make sure we're working with the right private equity firms that have portfolio companies that are complementary to your business, and therefore it makes sense for them. They really have a need to acquire you, and therefore will pay a good price. And I mentioned earlier the special purpose funds that will invest in software or other technologies companies, and we're seeing this more and more. Sovereign wealth funds, we're not seeing this as often except in special circumstances, shopping here in Silicon Valley. Large family offices, which typically grow out of very successful family businesses, and then they set up funds for making acquisitions, we're seeing them more and more. And they're often mission-driven or looking for very, very specific technologies. Okay, due diligence, really important subject. And we could have a whole seminar on this, but as a business owner, and having never been through the M&A process, you can find yourself in the position of the guy on the bottom there with the football. And big companies are looking at your business and looking, putting the pressure on you, and you can feel overwhelmed by it. It's our job as professionals, your banker and law firm, ourselves, and a firm like Craig's, to manage that process, to make sure you're prepared in advance, and it's important to plan. And so we'll typically give you large lists of items that you need to prepare in advance. And maybe I'll pause there. Craig, do you want to add any specific words on due diligence?
Well, the earlier you can start, the better. Obviously, it really does impact the whole process and really provides more efficiency and really certainty for the deal to close. Also, every acquisition document has something called a disclosure schedule, which discloses a lot of the material aspects of the company. And I would get started on that very early in the process. It's amazing how often the company can't find things or can't answer questions without some really detailed, long review of certain items, whether it deals with employee benefits or certain material contracts or IP, or even if there's been some past disputes or litigation. So it's very important to start that planning process very early.
Great, thanks. So here's a quick visual of the process and how it unfolds. T equals 0 here, where the X and Y axis meet, is where we and your professionals start working with you. And I mentioned one of the first things we do is estimate what we think we can sell a company for in the current market in a competitive process, and this is what we aim to set up with lots of bidders. A cautionary note on valuation. We often encounter situations where a business owner has gone to their CPA or other business evaluator, sometimes their commercial bank, and had a valuation done of the business, and sometimes that valuation is not very recent. We had one not too long ago where the business owner had a valuation 2 years ago, and was still wedded to the value despite changes in the business, and we will take a look at other evaluations that have been done, but ultimately we do our own work and we give our advice to the client what we think it's worth. Preparation, we've talked about that a lot. The company information, again, as a team, your professionals, we prepare get your due diligence ready, your legal and financial and business description due diligence ready. 2 important documents under company information. One is the executive summary, or another word for it is teaser. And this is a non-confidential, usually page or 2 summary of some key attributes of your business that we use in our initial canvas phase of potential buyers. And again, this doesn't mention the name of the company. It simply provides a description when we're testing the waters with our list of buyers, which we've created also in advance to see if there's interest. And then presentation. This is a information memorandum, company presentation, many different names for this. In the old days, this used to be a large landscape, a portrait rather, heavy Word doc. Nowadays, it's done via a visually attractive PowerPoint presentation that can show charts and graphs and great things about your business to really showcase it. So we create these two documents as well as pulling together your due diligence information. And then buyer's list. Again, we've talked about the importance of our work early on, identifying the right strategic buyers who can pay the most for your business. Contacting prospects, there are good ways to do this and there are bad ways to do this. Having worked at bigger investment banks and running a boutique, my experience is the bigger banks, the partners are out, looking for business and bringing in new clients because it's all about the volume of business done by the larger banks. And they leave the contacting of the prospects and often running the whole process of selling a business. They leave it to very junior people, and that's just the way the large scale model works, or even some sort of medium size. As a boutique, we do things differently, and the partners that you meet are the partners that are the ones who are going to be working on the deals, and we feel it's very important for the partners to be reaching out and doing the contacts, because you never know who you're going to get on the line when you make that call. One of my favorite stories is years ago, a colleague was calling Berkshire Hathaway. And much to his surprise, he got Warren Buffett on the line, and he actually apologized and said that his admin was out sick, and so he picked up the phone, and he had the opportunity to pitch directly to Warren Buffett. And feeling a little nervous, he quickly was prepared and discussed the opportunity and was said, sure, send us more details, send us an NDA. So you never know who you're going to get on the line, and it's very important that it's really a senior person, not a junior person struggling to read from a script. And we've also heard from executives that the thing they detest is when obviously an inexperienced or junior person is reading from a script. Negotiations are very key, and this is where we work more heavily with the law firm, our client's law firm, experienced law firm and M&A, such as Craig and Baker McKenzie, to make sure that we have the business and the legal items. We guide them on the valuation. This is when we're dealing with the buyers, focusing on a letter, receiving letters of intent, ideally multiple letters of intent at the same time. We set a deadline date for those letters of intent to come in, and we manage that process so our client ideally has the ability to choose from multiple attractive offers. One very important thing before a client signs a letter of intent, we always strongly recommend that their attorney review. There are many binding provisions that will sneak into these letters of intent, and it also is usually ties you up with exclusivity, because the buyer that you choose is then going to spend a lot of time negotiating the purchase and sale agreement, and also spending money on legal fees. So, Craig, I'm going to pause there and ask you for some comments on the letter of intent.
Right. So thank you, Jan. So typically the letter of intent will be non-binding except for the exclusivity period. Now the exclusivity period could be 30 to 60 days. As a seller, you would want that period as short as possible, so that if the deal does not go through with that buyer, you would be able to move quickly to another. A letter of intent generally may not be really in your best interest unless there's very detailed terms regarding the proposed sale. So obviously the price structure, if there's any contingency consideration or escrow, not that you'd want that, but you want to be very clear on those terms. The scope of the representation warranties, how long those survive the closing, as well as indemnification provisions, including very specific terms on those, whether there's a first dollar liability versus a deductible or a basket concept, and also having a cap on the liability and under the indemnification provisions, as well as any non-competes and any closing conditions. And it's very important to have a lawyer review those the terms. We've had situations where we've inherited term sheets that were never reviewed by a lawyer, and sometimes they'll have provisions that are completely not market or not even enforceable in California law. And even though maybe the buyer, backs down on those issues, they'll use that as a caveat or as leverage in future negotiations, saying, well, I did, I gave up on that, non-compete of 5 years, even though it was in the letter of intent, which was clearly unenforceable anyway under California law, but they basically kept using that as leverage throughout the process. So you want to make sure that you're very clear on a lot of these terms that could have adverse consequences to the seller. Also, you want to plan ahead and conduct any preliminary, antitrust or any regulatory or third-party type consent issues very early in the process. Obviously, a letter of intent is a signal that the buyer is very serious in their intentions to purchase the company. So you want to make sure that you have very clear terms in there, because those will permeate the whole process of the negotiations as well.
Thanks, Craig. Due diligence. I think we've discussed. Craig mentioned a third-party virtual data site, which we use and upload the confidential information into that, only accessible by buyers who've signed an NDA, and we use that throughout the rest of the process, including once the letter of intent exclusivity is signed. Then we shut off the other potential buyers, and only the final buyer gets to see the additional final due diligence information that's loaded in. Purchase and sale, very detailed, pages and pages of description of what the deal terms, representations, and warranties that you as the seller make, specific deal terms. And in negotiating this, we work very, very closely with the law firm, our client's law firm, as a team in negotiating the business and legal terms, and work with the other side. And it's really, this is definitely a team sport. So the right team is really critical. I'm going to turn it over to Craig in a second to talk more detail about a purchase and sale, but one of the things that we have found can be very effective if we have a process where it's very, very robust and a lot of excellent interest, is to get the seller's attorney to prepare the purchase and sale rather than the convention where the buyer usually wait for the buyer to prepare it. And it puts our client, the seller, more in the driver's seat with the terms to begin with, and then we often make potential purchasers comment on a draft purchase and sale. So, and Craig, is there perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the details and key issues in a purchase and sale agreement that business owners encounter?
That's right. Now, although price is of utmost concern to sellers, there's other issues that dramatically impact the price that you want to make sure that you very clearly analyze these. And these things are such as payment contingencies, including escrows, working capital adjustments, and earnouts. Those obviously have a very large impact on your ultimate net proceeds. Also, you want to analyze all deal structures to maximize the tax efficiencies. We'll probably have a separate webcast on that, but we could talk about that in very much detail. But generally, as sellers, you would prefer a stock purchase as opposed to an asset sale. Obviously, things such as representations and warranties have a very dramatic impact on your ultimate liabilities and indemnifications post-closing. So you want to very carefully analyze those and also make very appropriate disclosures or exceptions to those representations and warranties. Those disclosure schedules are generally exceptions to your representations and warranties, so you want to make sure those are worded properly, and if anything, over-disclose items so that those are accepted from your representations and warranties. Other things that are of utmost importance, obviously, are closing conditions, third-party approvals, non-competes, and obviously the ultimate terms of the indemnification provisions, such as the scope, exclusions, and baskets, and also the maximum caps and the term of the indemnification provisions. Generally, the governing law is not as a big issue if it's a domestic M&A transaction. Usually it'll be Delaware, California. If it was a foreign sale, obviously those would be a big issue too as well. Obviously, I think you want to prioritize what your main concerns are in the process very early, so that you can prioritize those and get the best negotiations and result in the process. And I would obviously try to make as many of these key terms very clear in the letter of intent, because if you don't, it can cause problems in the negotiation process for the purchase and sale agreement.
Great, thanks, Craig. And closing is the ultimate goal. Comments on the sale process. How back to the buyers, how we present and position the company is really important. There are all sorts of challenges throughout the process. Sometimes some buyers move more quickly, but it's our job as the bankers to make sure that we try to keep them in more or less in lockstep, speeding up some, slowing down others. I mean, sometimes we're even approached and a company has a letter of intent on the table and says, well, can you do better? Can you get us a better bid, or is this the best we're going to get? So we try to negotiate the letter of intent sort of on slow-mo and quickly canvass the market and see if we can find other bids to make it a competitive process. That's a tricky situation, but we have managed that in the past and done successful deals when in that situation. And if there's only one serious buyer, yes, we've had that situation too. And what's important, psychology is really important here, and managing the process and doing our best to manage that serious buyer and channel their thinking that they're not the only game in town. Board and team, sometimes we find that the board is not necessarily aligned and on the strategy and the process, and that can be an interesting challenge. Due diligence, we've talked about that. And lastly, one of the neglected areas is post-merger integration planning, which, everyone's racing to get the deal closed and get the best terms and price and everything else. And sometimes this planning for post-merger integration is neglected. When folks say, "Oh, a lot of M&A isn't successful," what do you think of that? Well, this is where it tends to fall down. Is the management teams don't focus enough on planning after the process. Okay, importance of your professional team. I'd like to say CPAs are also very key to this process, and we do need to work with your CPA and also your CFO. There are sometimes situations where we realize that perhaps there's a company controller that may not be prepared and ready to deal with the complexities of providing the right kind of financial information for an M&A deal. And again, this is part of the advice we'll give to the client early on if we feel that they're perhaps a fractional CFO to come in just for the M&A process. And we know many excellent ones and can be in a position to recommend those. And a similar comment on the lawyers. We can tell very early on if as a business owner, you've used an attorney for many, many years and you have someone you trust and like, they can certainly be on the team. But if we realize early on that they're perhaps not as experienced in M&A law, then, we will let you know as the business owner, and we can make recommendations such as Craig. Okay, value of growth. This is the last thing we'll talk about is timing, and then we'll wrap it up and take some questions. As a growing company, as a business, when do you want to plan your exit? Do you want to plan early as you're on a growth curve? Begin your exit when you're still growing. And we talked about the time frame it can take. Ideally, you make your optimal sale. You sell the business as you're still on a good trajectory so that you would get acquired and ride off to the sunset. Because if you get a late start and you're down the other side of the curve, it cannot be a pretty picture. You can be swimming with the sharks. They don't want that to happen. And sometimes if the business is turning down and you've missed the peak and your revenues are off, sometimes no exit happens. Sometimes we see in a crowded sector there's a lot of VC investment, and companies, if the consolidation is happening, you want to be there when the party's happening. You don't want to be left out. Because buyers go shopping too. Lots of social media, lots of information. More companies focus on exits, especially in a robust market like now. Music stops, can be bad news. You don't want that to happen. So in summary, M&A markets are still favorable for M&A, quite favorable for now. There's a large, diversified global pool of potential buyers, and it's our job as the bankers to identify them, and we've talked about how we go about doing that. Lots of cash, planning and preparation. Can't emphasize this one enough. Professionally managed process and how we can maximize your value, minimize the risk, and we've talked about timing, which is paramount. So I guess with that, I'll turn it back over to Jeff, and perhaps we have some questions that have come in, and Craig and I'd be happy to take your questions.
We have. Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Craig. So we have had a few questions come in. The first one I'll direct to Craig. So, and the question was, and I'll embellish a little bit. I already have a corporate lawyer. What's different about an M&A lawyer that I need to hire to engage someone differently?
Well, I think first of all, they know the market terms. It's very important that we're in a very good seller's market, first of all. And so the market can change dramatically from a few years ago, and also changes per industry and per geography and even subsector. So the terms of what's market can change very much. So it's great to have a seasoned M&A lawyer and an investment banker that knows those market terms. Obviously, also just the legal terms can be very unique also as well in those, and knowing what the current legal market is and also what the different solutions for different issues are from time to time. Especially also with tax reform, there's a lot of unique tax structures and issues that are coming that are very important, and also from a regulatory basis too. If you have a foreign buyer and there could be CFIUS concerns, it's very important to have a seasoned lawyer that knows how to negotiate those and go through the process both for CFIUS and also antitrust issues too as well. So all those type of issues can help. Also, it provides deal certainty, maximizes your price, and also eliminates risk. Nothing's more difficult than when you're dealing with a unseasoned M&A lawyer. It can make the process very painful. It can delay the process. It can keep transactions. I would much rather deal with an M&A lawyer who's at 1,000 lawyer firm, who's very experienced, because we can knock out issues very quickly. The most difficult negotiations are when you're dealing with people on the other side and they're not seasoned, because you have to explain every single issue to them, obviously, and a lot of times educate them on what the pros and cons, and I'll almost be their lawyer saying, well, here's the advantages of the issue, here's the disadvantages, here's the 2 or 3 scenarios, this is what we recommend for you, irrespective of what your lawyer's saying. So it can be very problematic. I've had a deal years ago with it was a very profitable company in a small town in Texas. They had a solo lawyer. It was the most painful transaction we had, and we had to do it in person as well. So we were camped out at a Holiday Inn for 2 weeks negotiating a deal with this solo attorney. And it almost closed the deal. At times we had to dumb down the negotiations constantly in order to accommodate them.
So this is a follow-on question, and also we talked about it briefly, and that is the additional complexity from a legal standpoint for a cross-border deal. I mean, it seems like Delaware and California is cross borders at times, but we're talking, the United States and other countries. How do you handle that?
Well, I think first of all, a lot of people misinterpret what cross-border means. You're seeing a lot of tech companies. They may be Delaware or California corporations, but they have subsidiaries and operations throughout the world.
Right.
And so that's cross-border. I mean, we have companies that are just selling, like, for example, in Europe, and we've run across so many issues where they're not properly, for example, adding the VAT tax or paying the value-added tax in the European Eurozone, and that's caused a lot of problems. So as far as, we have experts throughout the world in all those different countries. It helps smooth the process. It helps identify issues quickly and resolve those. We've also inherited a lot of deals from other U.S. firms where basically deals had to be unwound because they basically violated a lot of employment laws by the way they structured the transaction. Mm-hmm. And so those issues come up all the time, and it makes the process very efficient and eliminates risk. And obviously, if you have any regulatory approvals, which generally you will, particularly if you have any European or Asian operations based on your sales, it makes the process move much quicker and smoother.
Yeah, and can I, as Jan, perhaps I can just add to the issue on lawyers. It can, as back to Craig's story, but it delay the process in dealing with a sort of one shingle law firm down in, I think it was Texas. It can make your attorney at a disadvantage if he or she is not seasoned and up to date. So if they're a little bit rusty, yes, I'm sure they've been involved in M&A in some fashion, and perhaps it's in the past. And things do change, as Craig mentioned. And what you don't want is to have your attorney be at a disadvantage with the buyer, who's typically a bigger and possibly more sophisticated company that may have an attorney that is from a bigger firm that has done a lot of M&A deals. So you don't you want a specialist who practices regularly, and it can add to your legal fees, frankly, if your lawyer has to spend a lot of time kind of getting back up to speed.
All right. So we have time for one more question, and it's from someone here, obviously. And the question is, do you ever see breakup fees? Have you heard horror stories of big companies dragging out due diligence until a smaller company runs out of cash, and then they cut the offer?
So
quick answer. So we've got about
sure. I will say we almost never see breakup fees. Occasionally we do. It's much more in public to public deals, and there are some very specific reasons for that. Once in a while we see breakup fees as part of private company transactions, but in my experience it's very rare. However, as a banker, we'll usually, if a breakup fee ends up being paid to our client for whatever reason, then we will ask to share in those, assuming the deal breaks up and we've been representing the company. Craig, do you have any comments on breakup fees?
Well, generally there has to be some type of concern or contingencies in order to justify a breakup fee. And so usually you try to craft it around whatever that contingency may be, whether there's major concern about some type of litigation or regulatory approvals or something like that. So generally, yes, we generally only see those on public deals and not in the private middle market. And even then, we usually customize those to what the concern is that really raises the breakup fee.
Yeah, and sometimes if there is a specific concern about, and even in a private company, a buyer, perhaps looking, and particularly if it's a close competitor, then sometimes we will put, sort of a good faith breakup fee even in the letter of intent, if we can get it, and with the buyer, and therefore it's so, here's the price of taking a look, and in more detail, in the price of getting exclusivity, and once or twice over the years we've put those things in and got them signed, and therefore there was a breakup fee riding on the line, so that if the competitor just went looking and did not follow through, for whatever reasons, and the conditions are key, then they were obligated to pay a breakup fee. Now, has one ever been paid in those circumstances where we've put it into the letter? No. So it's really just a contingency.
Okay, well, I would like to thank everyone. It's certainly Craig and Jan are two panelists and experts today. What a lot of information. Again, this is Jeff Roach, and on behalf of Craig Lilly and Jan Robertson, thank you for your time today, and keep an eye out for your email. We'll do another one at least soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.